The morning of September 19th, 1944. Near the town of Haraucourt, in the Lorraine region of eastern France, a thin fog clings to the rolling hills, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. In a shallow depression behind a hedgerow, 3 American tank destroyers from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion sit in hull-down positions, their crews listening to the distant rumble of engines. They know what's coming. Panthers, the most feared tank in the German arsenal. Inside the lead M18 Hellcat, Sergeant Eugene Weston checks his ammunition count for what must be the 10th time that morning. 45 rounds total, 32 high explosives, 8 armor-piercing, and 5 rounds that look different from anything he's fired before, sleeker, lighter, with markings he doesn't entirely recognize. HVAP, the supply sergeant had called them when he handed them over the previous evening. High-velocity armor-piercing. Tungsten-cored. Use them on the big cats if you get the chance, the sergeant had said. We don't have many. That was an understatement. In the entire European theater of operations, fewer than 2,000 of these experimental rounds existed. Most American tank crews would never see one. Most would fight the entire war without ever having access to ammunition that could reliably defeat German heavy armor from the front. But Sergeant Weston had 5 chances to do what American doctrine said was impossible to kill a Panther without flanking it. The Germans who designed and built the Panther tank in 1943 believed they had created something close to invincible from the frontal aspect. The glacis plate, the sloped front hull armor, was 80 millimeters thick at 55 degrees from vertical. Basic geometry and metallurgy suggested this was equivalent to roughly 140 millimeters of flat plate. No Allied tank gun firing standard ammunition could penetrate it. Not the British 17-pounder, not the American 76mm, not even the American 3-inch gun mounted on the M10 tank destroyer. The Panther's designers had done the mathematics, they had run the penetration tables, they knew their armor scheme worked. By September of 1944, this confidence had been validated in combat across 2 continents. In Normandy, at Villers-Bocage, Panthers had shrugged off hits from Churchill tanks at point-blank range. In Italy, near Anzio, a single Panther had held off an entire American armored company for 3 hours, its frontal armor deflecting round after round. Near Caen, British tank crews reported in frustration that their shells were simply bouncing off. One Sherman commander described watching his solid shot ricochet skyward, like a stone skipping on water. The psychological impact was devastating. American tankers developed what one battalion commander called Panther paralysis, a reluctance to engage the German tanks head-on, even when tactical doctrine demanded it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. American ordnance officers knew they had a problem. The standard M62 armor-piercing round fired by the 76mm gun could penetrate 109 millimeters of flat armor at 1,000 yards. Against the Panther's sloped glacis, this wasn't enough. Even at point-blank range, the M62 frequently failed to penetrate. The gun mantlet, the rounded armor shield protecting the Panther's gun, could sometimes be defeated at close range, but hitting a target area less than 2 feet across while under fire from an 88mm cannon was asking a great deal of already frightened crews. The solution, when it came, was both elegant and problematic. Instead of trying to push a full-caliber steel projectile through heavy armor, American engineers designed a sub-caliber tungsten carbide penetrator surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body. The physics were straightforward. Reduce the projectile's cross-sectional density, increase its velocity, and concentrate all its kinetic energy on a smaller impact point. Tungsten carbide was nearly twice as hard as steel and had a higher melting point. It wouldn't deform on impact the way steel projectiles did. It would punch through. The first test firings in the summer of 1944 were remarkable. At 1,000 yards, the new round penetrated 178 millimeters of flat armor, a 63% improvement over the M62. At 500 yards, it could defeat 220 millimeters. On paper, this meant the Panther's glacis was now vulnerable. The supposedly invincible frontal armor could be defeated. American tank crews wouldn't need to risk flanking maneuvers against an opponent with superior gun range and armor protection. They could fight Panthers the way they fought Panzer IVs with direct frontal engagement. But there was a problem. Actually, there were several problems. The first was tungsten. The United States imported most of its tungsten from China, and the supply chain was precarious at best. By mid-1944, tungsten was needed for machine tools, for armor-piercing aircraft ammunition, for naval applications. Tank ammunition was low on the priority list. The second problem was production capacity. Even with unlimited tungsten, American factories couldn't produce HVAP rounds in large quantities. The manufacturing process was complex, requiring precision machining and careful quality control. A single defect could cause the round to tumble in flight or shatter on impact. The production numbers tell the story. In July of 1944, American factories produced exactly 1,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP ammunition, 1,000 rounds for an army that fielded thousands of tanks. In August, production doubled to 2,000 rounds. Even this modest increase strained the supply chain. The first 1,000 July production rounds were flown to France by air transport, arriving in time for testing at the Isigny firing range in late August. A second shipment of 3-inch HVAP rounds, compatible with the M10 tank destroyer's gun, followed. After that, everything came by ship, with the usual 10-week transit time from American factories to French depots. By September, when the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion moved into positions around Aracourt, the entire European theatre had received perhaps 3,000 HVAP rounds total, split between 76mm and 3-inch. Priority went to tank destroyer battalions. Their mission was explicitly anti-tank, unlike Sherman tank battalions, which spent most of their ammunition on infantry support. Even with priority, tank destroyer crews received an average of 2 to 3 rounds per vehicle. Some received none at all. Sergeant Weston's 5 rounds made him comparatively wealthy. The Germans, meanwhile, had no idea these rounds existed. German intelligence was generally excellent when it came to tracking Allied equipment and capabilities. They had detailed files on the Sherman tank, the M10 tank destroyer, and the P-47 fighter bomber. They knew the penetration values of standard American ammunition. They had captured examples of every major Allied weapon system and tested them extensively at proving grounds near Kummersdorf and Hillersleben. The Panther's armor scheme had been designed with full knowledge of Allied anti-tank capabilities as of 1943. Those capabilities hadn't changed, or so German intelligence believed. This intelligence failure wasn't entirely Germany's fault. The HVAP round was so new and so rare that even most American tankers didn't know it existed. The development process had been rushed, compressed from the usual multi-year cycle down to a few frantic months between May and September of 1944. There had been no time for the kind of widespread field testing that normally preceded adoption of new ammunition. There had been no time for doctrine to evolve around the new capability. The first American crews to fire HVAP in combat were essentially beta testers, learning through trial and error what the round could and couldn't do. What it could do, as Sergeant Weston was about to discover, was punch through the front of a Panther tank at combat ranges. What it couldn't do was arrive in sufficient quantities to matter strategically. This was the central irony of the HVAP story. The United States had developed a technological solution to the Panther problem just in time for that solution to be irrelevant. The rounds were too rare, arrived too late, and came in too small quantities to change the fundamental dynamics of tank warfare on the Western Front. But for the individual crews who had them, for the men like Sergeant Weston who carried those 5 precious rounds in their ready rack, HVAP represented something more valuable than tactical advantage. It represented hope, the hope that they weren't entirely outmatched, that they had at least a fighting chance when the Panthers came. The fog was starting to lift. Through his periscope, Sergeant Weston could see perhaps 200 yards now. The engine noise was closer, distinctive. The high-pitched whine of a Maybach HL 230 engine, 700 horsepower pushing 45 tons of steel. He'd heard that sound before, in Normandy, always followed by the crack of 88mm guns and the screaming of wounded men. His loader, a 19-year-old kid from Wisconsin named Tommy Hendricks, was pale-faced and silent. His gunner, Corporal James Mitchell, had both hands on the traverse wheel, scanning methodically left to right, waiting. Range? Range? Weston asked, voice steady. 400 yards and closing. Mitchell replied. I see, Jesus. I see 8 of them, 8 Panthers in a column. 8. Weston did the mathematics automatically. 5 HVAP rounds, 3 armor-piercing, 8 targets. Even if every shot was a kill, which it wouldn't be, they'd run out of anti-tank ammunition before they ran out of Germans. He keyed his radio, heard the other Hellcat commanders checking in. B Company had 9 tank destroyers in position, maybe 30 HVAP rounds total, if they were lucky, against what looked like most of an entire German Panzer company. This was the moment. This was where American ingenuity and German engineering collided, where theoretical penetration tables met combat reality, where a handful of experimental tungsten-cored rounds faced the supposedly invincible frontal armor of Hitler's Panther tanks. Neither side fully understood what was about to happen. The Germans advancing through the fog certainly didn't. The crews of Panzer Brigade 113 had been training on Panthers for less than a month. Most were veterans transferred from destroyed units on the Eastern Front, men who'd fought in Panzer IVs and knew the basics of armored warfare. But the Panther was new to them. They'd been told it was superior to anything the Americans possessed. They'd been told its frontal armor was proof against all Allied tank guns. They'd been told to advance aggressively, to use their superior range and protection to dominate the battlefield. That confidence, that certainty of technological superiority, was about to be shattered in a way that would echo through German tank crews for the rest of the war. But first, the fog had to lift. First, the targets had to present themselves. First, Sergeant Weston had to make a decision that would violate every piece of doctrine he'd been taught, to engage a Panther from the front, at medium range, with ammunition he'd never fired in combat before. The sound of engines grew louder. Through the thinning fog, shapes began to resolve. The distinctive low profile of the Panther, the long barrel of the 75mm HVAP-42 gun, 8 of them, advancing in a staggered column 200 yards apart, following a heading that would bring them within 300 yards of the American positions. Target, Corporal Mitchell said quietly. Lead Panther, 350 yards. Weston's hand moved to the ammunition selector. He had to choose. High explosives would do nothing against that armor. Standard armor piercing might penetrate the turret at this range if they got lucky, if the angle was perfect. Or he could use one of his 5 HVAP rounds, 1/5 of his supply on the very first target. But if it worked, if the penetration tables were accurate, he could kill that Panther with a frontal hit. He could do what American tank doctrine said was impossible. Load HVAP, he ordered. The brass shell casing was lighter than Tommy Hendricks expected. He'd loaded hundreds of 76mm rounds during training, and they all had a similar heft. This one felt almost hollow. He slid it into the breech anyway, slammed the breech block closed, tapped Sergeant Weston's shoulder. Up! The Panther was 300 yards away now, still advancing, still unaware. The German commander probably couldn't see the hull-down Hellcats through the fog and the hedgerows, or if he could see them, he probably assumed they were Sherman's targets to be destroyed at leisure once the range closed. Why would he worry? He was in a Panther. The Americans were in thin-skinned tank destroyers with less than an inch of frontal armor. One hit from his 88mm would be catastrophic. He had every reason to be confident. Steady, Weston said. Traverse right, 280 yards. Aim center mass, lower glacis if you can. Mitchell adjusted. The crosshairs settled on the Panther's lower hull, just below where the glacis met the vertical lower plate. At this angle, this range, it was the best shot they were going to get. Standard doctrine said to wait for a flank shot. Standard doctrine said frontal engagement with a Panther was suicide. But standard doctrine was written before HVAP. Fire. The Hellcat rocked backward. The 76mm gun threw the HVAP round down range at over 3,400 feet per second, nearly 3 times the speed of sound. 14 pounds of projectile, with a tungsten carbide penetrator core traveling so fast it glowed white-hot from atmospheric friction. It crossed the 280 yards to the target in less than 1/3 of a second. What happened next would be recounted in after-action reports, analyzed by ordnance experts, and eventually make its way into German intelligence files as one of the first confirmed instances of American supervelocity ammunition defeating Panther frontal armor in combat conditions. The HVAP round struck the Panther's lower glacis 3 inches left of centerline. For a fraction of a second, nothing seemed to happen. Then the entire front of the Panther erupted in a shower of sparks and molten metal. The tungsten penetrator punched through the 80mm plate like it was cardboard, the extreme velocity and hardness overcoming the armor's resistance. Inside the tank, The penetrator and a spray of armor fragments ricocheted through the fighting compartment at hypersonic speeds. The result was catastrophic. Ammunition detonated. The Panther lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from every hatch. 3 seconds after impact, flames were visible. "Hit!" Mitchell shouted. "We got him! We got a frontal kill!" Sergeant Weston was already calling targets. Second Panther, 320 yards, same ammunition. They had 4 HVAP rounds left, 7 more Panthers, and now the Germans knew they were there. The second round fired 90 seconds after the first. Another hit, this time on the turret front. Penetration again confirmed by the immediate eruption of smoke and fire. The Panther slewed sideways, its right track shattered, crew bailing out. 2 kills, 2 HVAP rounds, 2 frontal penetrations against supposedly impenetrable armor. The German company commander was now transmitting frantically on the radio, warning his remaining tanks about a new American weapon, an unknown type of ammunition that could defeat Panther armor from the front. But his warnings came too late. The other Hellcats had opened fire. More HVAP rounds streaked through the morning air. More Panthers brewed up. Within 5 minutes, 6 of the 8 Panthers were destroyed or disabled. The remaining 2 reversed frantically, seeking cover, their confidence shattered along with their armor. The Battle of Aracourt would continue for another 10 days, but those first 5 minutes on the morning of September 19th established a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the engagement. American tank destroyers, using the handful of HVAP rounds available to them, repeatedly defeated Panthers in circumstances that should have been suicide for the lightly armored M18S. By the end of the battle, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed or damaged over 50 German armored vehicles, including at least 23 Panthers. Their own losses: 3 M18s destroyed, 5 damaged. But the statistics, dramatic as they were, didn't tell the complete story. The real story was unfolding several hundred miles to the east in German tank training schools and maintenance depots, where ordnance experts were beginning to examine damaged Panthers recovered from the battlefield. What they found confused them. The standard penetration pattern for American 76mm armor-piercing ammunition was well documented. The M62 round would either bounce off the glacis entirely, leaving a shallow crater and scorch marks, or if the angle and range were perfect, it would crack the armor without fully penetrating, creating spalling on the interior surface that could wound or kill crew members. Full penetration of the glacis was theoretically impossible at combat ranges. The Germans had done the mathematics. They knew their armor worked. But the Panthers coming back from Aracourt told a different story. The penetrations were clean, small entry holes with extensive damage radiating outward, characteristic of hypervelocity impact. The holes were also noticeably smaller in diameter than the 76mm bore size. This suggested a sub-caliber projectile, and the interior damage was unlike anything German ordnance experts had seen from American ammunition before. The penetrator had continued through the fighting compartment, often passing completely through the opposite side of the vehicle. In several cases, the tungsten core had struck ammunition racks, causing catastrophic detonations that blew turrets 20 feet from their ring mounts. By late September, German intelligence had recovered fragments of the projectile itself from several destroyed Panthers. Chemical analysis confirmed tungsten carbide, a material Germany had largely stopped using for ammunition by mid-1944 due to tungsten shortages. The Americans, it seemed, still had access to sufficient tungsten to produce super-velocity rounds, and those rounds were effective, devastatingly so. A report dated October 3, 1944, from German 5th Panzer Army headquarters to OKW, the Armed Forces High Command, described the new American ammunition in unusually stark terms. The report noted that captured examples of the projectile showed exceptional penetration capability against even heavy armor at combat ranges previously thought safe. More significantly, the report acknowledged that previous calculations regarding the invulnerability of the Panther's glacis plate to American tank weapons may require revision. This was as close as German military bureaucracy could come to admitting they'd been wrong. The Panther's frontal armor wasn't invincible. American guns could defeat it. The careful calculations that had gone into the Panther's design, the geometry, the metallurgy, the testing at Kummersdorf had all been rendered moot by a technological development German intelligence had failed to predict. The psychological impact on German tank crews was immediate and profound. Throughout October and November of 1944, German after-action reports from the Western Front increasingly referenced concerns about American tungsten ammunition or super-velocity rounds. Panther crews, who had previously felt confident engaging Shermans at medium range, now hesitated. The doctrine of frontal engagement, press forward, use your armor advantage, dominate the battlefield, began to break down. If American tank destroyers could kill you from the front at 400 yards, what was the point of having thick frontal armor? But here's where the story takes its most ironic turn. The German concerns, while justified by the evidence they'd seen at Aracourt, were massively disproportionate to the actual threat. The Germans had encountered perhaps 30 HVAP rounds in combat during September. They'd lost 24 Panthers to those rounds, and from this limited sample, they'd concluded reasonably that the Americans had developed a new standard ammunition type that threatened the entire basis of German tank design. They were wrong. HVAP wasn't standard ammunition. It wasn't even close to widespread deployment. By October of 1944, the entire European theater had received perhaps 15,000 HVAP rounds total, split between 3-inch and 76mm. This sounds like a lot, until you realize the US Army in Europe fielded thousands of vehicles capable of firing these rounds. The average Sherman tank equipped with a 76mm gun received between 2 and 5 HVAP rounds by the end of October. Tank destroyer battalions received slightly more, perhaps 8 to 10 rounds per vehicle. But that was it. Once those rounds were expended, crews were back to fighting with standard ammunition, back to the same impossible mathematics that said you couldn't kill a Panther from the front. The production numbers explain why. In November of 1944, American factories produced 10,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP and 5,000 rounds of 3-inch. In December, the same. These monthly production figures sound impressive until you calculate how many tanks those rounds were supposed to supply. By December, the US Army in Europe had over 4,000 Sherman tanks, plus hundreds of M10 and M18 tank destroyers. 15,000 HVAP rounds per month, distributed across 4,000 vehicles, works out to less than 4 rounds per vehicle, and that's assuming perfect distribution, which never happened in practice. Real-world distribution was a nightmare. HVAP rounds shipped from American factories to European depots took 10 weeks in transit. They arrived at port facilities in England or France, where they entered a supply system designed for bulk commodities, not rare specialty ammunition. Getting HVAP rounds from a depot in Cherbourg to a tank battalion fighting near the German border required multiple handoffs through different echelons of supply. At each stage, someone had to recognize what these rounds were, understand their value, and prioritize their movement forward. Often, this didn't happen. HVAP rounds sat in depot warehouses, while tank crews 5 miles from the front line had none. Even when the rounds reached forward units, there was confusion about how to employ them. Most crews had never fired HVAP in training. They didn't know its ballistics, its trajectory characteristics, or its optimal engagement range. The round traveled significantly faster than standard ammunition, over 3,000 feet per second versus 2,600, which meant the gunner had to adjust his aim point. Fire HVAP like you'd fire standard AP, and you'd shoot high, potentially missing the target entirely. This required training, but there was no time for training. The rounds arrived, were distributed, and crews were expected to figure them out in combat. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. There were also technical problems. The tungsten carbide core, while extremely hard, was also brittle. Impact against highly sloped armor sometimes caused the penetrator to shatter rather than penetrate. This was particularly common when engaging the Panther's upper glacis at shallow angles. The round worked best against flat or moderately sloped armor, which is why tank destroyer crews learned to aim for the lower hull rather than the upper glacis. But this meant exposing yourself for the extra fraction of a second needed to precisely aim at a smaller target. In the middle of a tank battle, with 88mm rounds coming back at you, that fraction of a second could be fatal. The metallurgy of HVAP also created unexpected problems. Different production batches had slightly different performance characteristics, depending on the specific tungsten alloy used and the manufacturing process. Early production rounds, the so-called T4 variant, had a tendency to ricochet off highly sloped armor, even when the penetration tables said they should go through. An improved version, designated T4E17, arrived in late autumn with better performance. This was refined further into the T4E20 in December, which was finally standardized as the M93 in early 1945. But this meant that crews might have multiple versions of HVAP in their ready rack, each with slightly different characteristics, none of them labeled in a way that made the differences obvious. For the Germans on the receiving end, none of these complications mattered. They'd seen what HVAP could do at Aracourt. They'd examined the penetrations, analyzed the fragments, and read the reports. And they'd concluded entirely reasonably, given the limited evidence, that the Americans had solved the Panther problem. The psychological damage was done. The Panther's invincibility, so carefully constructed through engineering and propaganda, had been shattered, and once that psychological armor was breached, it could never be fully restored. This fear manifested in unexpected ways. In November of 1944, German tank crews in the West began reporting avoiding engagement with what they thought were Sherman tanks at medium range, fearing tungsten ammunition. Panthers that should have pressed forward hesitated. Commanders who should have exploited their superior gun range instead sought cover. The tactical aggressiveness that had characterized German armored operations in the summer, the willingness to close with inferior opponents and destroy them, gave way to caution and uncertainty. The irony, of course, was that most of the Sherman tanks the Germans were avoiding didn't have HVAP. Most didn't even have 76mm guns as late as January of 1945. Only about a quarter of Sherman tanks in Europe had been upgraded from the older 75mm gun. And of those upgraded tanks, most carried 0 HVAP rounds. The Germans were phantom fighting a threat that barely existed. But for the German soldiers who had experienced HVAP personally, who had seen their supposedly invincible tanks penetrated from the front, who had pulled wounded crewmen from burning Panthers after frontal hits that shouldn't have been possible, the threat was very real. These men wrote letters home, talked to replacement crews, spread word through the informal networks that connected frontline soldiers. The Panther was vulnerable. American guns could kill it. The war was lost. This message reached even more. Soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, the Ardennes offensive, threw German armored units against American positions in Belgium and Luxembourg, including tank destroyer battalions that had been preferentially supplied with HVAP for the emergency. The 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, fighting near Bastogne, used HVAP to knock out multiple Panthers and King Tigers, the latter being supposedly immune even to HVAP when struck on the frontal armor. The penetrations were confirmed by American forces, who later examined the destroyed vehicles. Small entry holes, characteristic of high-velocity tungsten penetrators, in armor plates that should have been proof against anything the Americans could throw. German prisoners captured during the Bulge, when interrogated about their equipment and tactics, frequently mentioned American special ammunition as a source of concern. One Panther commander, captured after his tank was disabled near Rocherath, described his shock at being penetrated through the front, at distance, by a tank destroyer. I could barely see through the snow. Another prisoner, a loader in a King Tiger, spoke of recovering a damaged American round from his tank's hull after a non-penetrating hit. I couldn't believe how small the projectile was. We had been told our armor was too thick for their guns. But this thing, I knew then that we could be killed. These testimonies, preserved in American intelligence reports, reveal the psychological dimension of HVAP's impact. The round didn't just defeat German armor physically. It defeated German confidence. It shattered the narrative of invincibility that had been so carefully constructed around tanks like the Panther and Tiger. And in doing so, it achieved strategic effects far beyond its actual tactical impact, because the tactical impact, viewed objectively, was minimal. From September 1944 through March 1945, American forces in Europe received approximately 50,000 rounds of HVAP across all calibers. This equipped roughly 7,000 tanks and tank destroyers, giving each vehicle an average of 7 rounds. 7 chances per vehicle to achieve what HVAP promised frontal kills on German heavy armor. Compared to the hundreds of thousands of standard armor-piercing rounds fired during the same period, HVAP represented less than 1% of total anti-tank ammunition expenditure. Yet this 1% had a disproportionate impact, not because it destroyed disproportionate numbers of German tanks, though it certainly destroyed some, but because it changed German behavior. It made Panther crews hesitant. It disrupted German armored doctrine. It forced German intelligence to devote resources to understanding and countering a threat that, in practical terms, barely existed. The United States had achieved something remarkable, a psychological victory through technological innovation, on a battlefield where technological parity was otherwise impossible to achieve. But this victory came at a cost that wouldn't be fully apparent until after the war. The cost was measured in American lives, tankers who died fighting Panthers with standard ammunition because HVAP wasn't available. The cost was measured in battles that took longer than necessary, in casualties that mounted while supply sergeants searched depots for ammunition that wasn't there. The cost was measured in the realization, which came slowly to American military leadership, that having a solution to the Panther problem wasn't the same as deploying that solution at scale. Consider mathematics from the American perspective. By March of 1945, U.S. tank battalions had fired approximately 19,000 rounds of HVAP in combat since September. They'd achieved an estimated kill rate of perhaps 25%, one destroyed or disabled German vehicle for every 4 HVAP rounds fired. This sounds reasonable until you compare it to the estimated 50,000 German armored vehicles, tanks, assault guns, tank destroyers that were on the Western Front during this period. Even with perfect distribution and employment, HVAP could account for less than 10% of German armor destroyed. The rest had to be dealt with through traditional means, flanking maneuvers, artillery, airstrikes, or simply accepting higher casualty rates in frontal engagement. The United States had created a wonder weapon, but they'd created it too late, in too small quantities, to change the fundamental dynamics of armored warfare on the Western Front. This realization hit hardest among the ordnance officers who had shepherded HVAP through development and production. They'd done everything asked of them. They'd designed an effective round. They'd established production. They'd shipped it to Europe. And it wasn't enough. Could never have been enough, given the tungsten supply constraints and manufacturing limitations. In the spring of 1945, with Germany collapsing, American ordnance temporarily stopped HVAP production. The tungsten was needed elsewhere. The existing stockpiles were sufficient for the remaining weeks of war. And besides, by April of 1945, German armor was increasingly scarce. Many Panther battalions had been destroyed or captured. Others sat immobile for lack of fuel. The need for HVAP, the desperate, urgent need that had driven its development, had passed. The final count, compiled after Germany's surrender, showed that American forces in Europe had received approximately 60,000 HVAP rounds of all calibers between August of 1944 and May of 1945. Of these, roughly 25,000 had been fired in combat. The rest remained in depot stockpiles, in unit inventories, in ready racks of tanks that never encountered German armor. The production had finally caught up with demand, just as the demand disappeared. But the German perspective, the view from inside a Panther tank, knowing that American guns could now kill you from the front, that perspective outlasted the war. German tankers who survived carried with them memories of HVAP penetrations. They remembered Panthers burning after frontal hits. They remembered checking ammunition types nervously, wondering if the next incoming round was tungsten-cored. And after the war, when historians interviewed survivors, those memories shaped the narrative that emerged. German veterans consistently overestimated HVAP's prevalence. In memoirs and interviews, they described American tanks as typically equipped with tungsten ammunition or spoke of HVAP as standard by late 1944. These claims weren't lies, they were honest misrememberings, shaped by the psychological impact of encountering HVAP even in small quantities. The Germans had been told their armor was invincible. HVAP proved it wasn't. And the human mind, confronted with such a fundamental contradiction, revised its memories to make the outcome seem less surprising in retrospect. One particularly revealing interview, conducted in 1978 with a former Panther commander named Ernst Bachmann, captured this psychological process. Bachmann had fought in Normandy, at Aricourt, and in the Ardennes. He'd survived the war, his Panther knocked out 3 times but never destroyed. When asked about HVAP, he initially claimed to have encountered it constantly after September of 1944. But when pressed for specific incidents, he could only clearly recall 2 occasions when he believed his tank was struck by tungsten-cored ammunition. 2 encounters in 8 months of combat, yet in his memory, these 2 encounters had expanded to represent the totality of his experience, with American anti-tank weapons. This wasn't unique to Bachmann. Interview after interview, memoir after memoir, German tankers described HVAP as ubiquitous while simultaneously describing only one or two actual encounters with it. The psychological impact had been so profound that it warped memory itself. The Americans had created a legend, a technological bogeyman that far exceeded the actual material threat. And here's the final irony. After the war, when American ordnance analysts examined German tank development from 1944 and 1945, they found evidence that German engineers had begun modifying the Panther's armor scheme specifically to counter HVAP. Late production Panthers featured additional armor plates welded to the lower glacis, exactly where American HVAP rounds had proven most effective. The Germans were devoting scarce industrial capacity, scarce steel, and scarce welding labor to counter a threat that affected less than 1% of American anti-tank ammunition. The cost in German productivity was measurable. Each additional armor plate added time to the production process, time that German industry, under constant aerial bombardment, couldn't afford. Weight that German transmissions, already overtaxed, couldn't handle. Complexity that German factory workers, increasingly composed of forced laborers and poorly trained conscripts, couldn't consistently execute. The modifications degraded the Panther's already questionable mechanical reliability. Transmission failures increased. Engine problems multiplied, all to counter ammunition that most American tankers never even saw. This is how wars are won and lost, not through dramatic battles or grand strategies, but through accumulated small decisions based on incomplete information. German intelligence had the information they'd captured HVAP rounds, examined the penetrations, read the reports. But they couldn't know the production constraints, the supply bottlenecks, the distribution failures that made HVAP functionally irrelevant at strategic scale. They saw the weapon's capability and assumed capability equaled availability. It was a reasonable assumption. It was also wrong. The Americans, meanwhile, had their own intelligence failure. They knew HVAP worked. They'd seen it kill Panthers at Aracourt, at Bastogne, in a dozen smaller engagements. But they didn't fully understand its psychological impact on German crews. They didn't realize that a handful of tungsten rounds could disrupt German armored doctrine more effectively than thousands of standard rounds. If they had understood this, if they'd prioritized HVAP production even slightly higher, sacrificed tungsten from other applications to make even a few thousand more rounds, the psychological effect could have been multiplied. German caution could have been amplified. The cost in American lives could have been reduced. But they didn't know, couldn't know. War is fought through fog, literal and metaphorical, where neither side fully understands the situation. The Germans feared HVAP because they'd experienced its effects without understanding its limitations. The Americans deployed HVAP without understanding that its true power wasn't ballistic, it was psychological. On a Tuesday afternoon in early March of 1945, in a depot outside Cherbourg, France, a supply sergeant named Robert Chen was conducting inventory. His warehouse held thousands of rounds of 76mm ammunition, high explosive, white phosphorus, standard armor piercing, and in one corner, carefully segregated and marked with red tags, 347 rounds of HVAP. They'd been sitting there since January. No unit had requested them. Most units didn't even know they existed. Chen picked up one of the rounds, felt its unusual lightness. He'd heard stories about these, how they could punch through Panthers like tinfoil, how tank destroyer crews hoarded them like gold. He wondered why no one wanted them anymore. I wondered what had changed. What had changed was simple. There were no more Panthers to shoot at. By March of 1945, the great armored battles of the Western Front were over. German tanks sat immobile for lack of fuel, or hidden in forests for lack of crews, or captured at road junctions by advancing Allied armies. The urgent, desperate need that had driven HVAP's development had evaporated. The rounds were obsolete before their production run was complete. Sergeant Chen logged the inventory and moved on. The HVAP rounds stayed in the depot. Some would eventually be shipped back to the United States for analysis and testing. Some would be expended at post-war training ranges. A few would end up in museums, curiosities from a moment when American industry briefly solved a problem just as that problem ceased to exist. But the impact of those rounds, the psychological impact on German tank crews who encountered them, the tactical impact on battles where they were present, the strategic impact of forcing German industry to respond to a threat that barely existed, that impact endured. In the memories of veterans on both sides, in the intelligence reports and after-action summaries that shaped post-war doctrine, in the realization, which came slowly to military strategists, that sometimes the perception of a weapon matters more than its actual prevalence. The Germans who designed the Panther had created what they believed was an invincible tank. They'd done the mathematics, run the tests, validated their calculations in combat across 2 continents. They were right within the parameters of mid-1943 technology. The Panther's frontal armor was invincible. But technology doesn't respect parameters. It evolves. And HVAP, rushed into production 18 months after the Panther entered service, shattered the invincibility that German engineers had so carefully constructed. The Americans who developed HVAP created what they believed was a war-winning weapon. They'd done the ballistics, solved the metallurgy, pushed the round from concept to production in record time. They were wrong. The production and distribution problems made HVAP strategically irrelevant, despite its tactical effectiveness. But weapons don't win wars through statistics alone. They win through the accumulated impact of every engagement, every penetration, every burning tank that forces the enemy to question their assumptions. What happened in the fog near Aracourt on that September morning in 1944 wasn't just a tank battle. It was a collision between 2 worldviews, one that believed engineering could create invulnerability, and one that believed engineering could defeat invulnerability. Both were partly right, both were partly wrong, and the space between what each side believed and what was actually true, that space determined outcomes more than armor, thickness, or muzzle velocity ever could. Sergeant Weston survived the war, came home to Cleveland, worked in a machine shop, raised 3 kids. He rarely talked about his time in the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, but on the few occasions when someone asked, when the question came up about what it was like to face Panthers, he'd pause, think for a moment, and say, "We had 5 rounds. 5 chances to do something everyone said was impossible. And they worked. All 5 of them worked. 5 rounds. In a war that consumed hundreds of millions of artillery shells, tank rounds, bullets, 5 special rounds that worked. That's what HVAP represented. Not mass production or industrial supremacy, just 5 rounds that worked when they absolutely had to, carried by men who used them well, against an enemy who never understood how rare those rounds actually were. The Germans feared what they couldn't defeat. The Americans deployed what they couldn't produce in quantity. And somewhere between that fear and that limitation, the outcome of armored warfare on the Western Front was decided, not by the rounds that were fired, but by the rounds that might have been fired, not by actual capability, but by perceived capability, not by reality, but by the space between what each side thought the other possessed and what actually existed. That's the real story of HVAP, not a story of technological triumph or industrial failure, a story of partial solutions, incomplete information, and the way small developments, rare developments, developments that affected less than 1% of combat engagements, can ripple outward to change the character of a war. The Panther wasn't defeated by HVAP, but the Panther's invincibility was, and in the end, that mattered more. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.